Well, good afternoon, dear friends. Ratus, welcome to the Competency-Based Interview course. We have our first session where we learn what we call competencies, what is the difference between hard skills and soft skills, and how it all came about, how we came to it. Why do you need to study competency-based interviewing? It's for recruiters and managers who want to master the most accurate tool for evaluating candidates, because the competency-based interview, it provides an extremely accurate assessment. This is the course website. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself, just to introduce myself in case we don't know each other. My name is Mike Pritula. I worked as a recruiter and trainer in Alpha Bank, then as head of adaptation recruitment at STB TV channel, and then HR director, HR business partner at Wargaming, and HR head of Prey and ID. I have been associated with recruiting for many years and continue to be associated with it. I've been picking up jobs, more precisely candidates on their own, about 500 vacancies closed. My teams picked up candidates on STB TV channel. We closed about 3,000 vacancies, and the case with a smaller company, but there we had a more high-tech search. Well, in terms of competency-based interviews, I learned this tool at Alpha Bank, and I immediately realized how useful and effective it was. When I worked at STB TV channel, I trained my recruiters how to conduct competency-based interviews. By the way, I read about recruiting, coaching, and game day. The left also aligned recruiting with competency assessment. When I was building my career, winning different nominations, just so you have an understanding of who is in front of you. And I have international certifications. It's a bit about our academy, also lots of awards and not a bad history of development. I rely on global best practices, courses, and share my personal experience and best practices. I would be grateful if you could write about yourself. What is your position? Are you a recruiter, head of HR recruiting, manager, so that it is clear who we are dealing with today and what you are responsible for in the company. So it's not hard. Write a little bit about yourself. As we move on, so you write, I'll read. I'll tell you about the homework. In this course, they are waiting for you. They will allow you to practice with the buildings you have received and receive our diploma when all homework assignments have been accepted. We issue diplomas online on the Accreditable platform. The course consists of a rather capacious 6 sessions, where we go through the entire competency-based interview cycle and learn absolutely all the techniques that are needed for this interview. Today we will learn about the history of the competency, the hard-soft skill. What is the advantage of using competency language in the interview, and learn what ready-made libraries are available and how to use them properly. Okay, here is the first reply I see. Good evening. I have been working for over a year as a recruiter for a DNA employment agency. Nice to meet you, Dina. Thank you for writing. Let's move on for now. So let's start with why it's important not to make mistakes in recruiting. This is exactly what the competency-based interview gives us. When we in recruiting get it wrong, this company is worth the money. If it costs about 6 salaries to fire a company employee, this has already been calculated. It has also been calculated that the moment a company makes a mistake and wrongly hires, its losses from 12 to 18 salaries of that person who was wrongly hired. That is, if we hire an employee, salary of $1,000, we made a mistake in him, we then fire him and have to look for his replacement, our loss, if you count everything, direct and cosmic, loss of time, loss of productivity, loss of customers, will be $12,000–$18,000. That's quite a lot of money, an expense that could have been avoided by just hiring right away. How does this assessment work? Why are we talking about competency-based interviews? The fact is that there are many studies that have analyzed different methods of evaluating candidates. Companies, we're about to find out, companies have been wanting to hire people in a way that's not wrong for decades. When companies hire people and people then do a great job, companies see how cool it is, how productive it is, how much they wish they could always do it that way. So companies have long been on the lookout for methods on how not to make mistakes. And there are many studies that have tested different methods. How were these methods tested? Very easy. See, when a candidate is interviewed at the selection stage, some sort of approach is taken and marks are given. Then our candidate works and shows some kind of result. And that too is rated on some sort of scale too. And then the results in the work are compared with the results of the interview time. If the scores are the same, then there are highly effective interview candidates who are also effective. It is a matter of high correlation between these indicators, and then the assessment tool is accurate. Well, and vice versa, if candidates who interviewed well then performed poorly, and those who interviewed in their homelands especially did not shine, but performed outstandingly, then the assessment tool was wrong. And just like that, companies have come up with the most accurate assessment tools. The question of how to properly evaluate candidates began more than 2,000 years ago. This is evidenced by a book by an Indian official called At Arha Shastra, or The Science of Politics in translation, the authorship of Otilia belongs to. And there already in that book she wrote how all kinds of officials should be hired, and it mentions a lot of different approaches, a lot of different methods, and so on. Well, let's read it. The king must carefully examine all the qualities of anyone he considers for a ministerial appointment. These qualities, nationality, family background, and ability to be disciplined, should be verified by reliable people. The candidate's knowledge in various arts is tested by experts in the respective fields. Intelligence, perseverance, and dexterity are assessed by examining past performance, while eloquence, courage, and presence of mind are evaluated through personal interviews. Observing how they interact with others will reveal their energy, stamina, ability to endure hardships, honesty, loyalty, and friendliness. From close friends, the Tsar learns about their strength, health, and character, whether they are lazy or energetic, erratic or steady. The candidate's affability and love for humanity, meaning a lack of tendency towards hatred, should be confirmed through personal observation. If we draw parallels with modern assessment tools, we see a variety of methods. It's been 2,400 years. I'm not talking about all companies, but many, of course, companies like Google are doing great. They've studied, perfected, and honed these methods, doing everything right. But many companies still don't understand competencies, can't distinguish hard skills from soft skills, and conduct chaotic, unstructured interviews. They even do training without assessing competencies first, and managers are chosen without evaluating their leadership abilities. What has happened in the last 100 years? There have been many significant advancements in the last 100 years, and that's thanks to certain people. Look, at the beginning of the 20th century, the main required competencies were those that workers gained through years of on-the-job experience. Then Ford began evaluating people's ability to do monotonous work and their physical endurance rather than past experience to select people for assembly line work. During World War II, there was demand for military personnel who could follow orders without question. An important turning point came in the early 1960s when McClelland wrote a landmark article in American Psychologist arguing that IQ and personality tests, which were widely used, could be predictors of competence. He believed hiring should be based not just on IQ but also on competencies. This name is very useful to remember for those interested in the topic of competencies. His name was McClelland. He was the founder of the consulting company McBair and was invited by the US State Department to develop new methods that could predict job performance. The goal was to eliminate potential biases in traditional intelligence and aptitude analysis. Traditional selection criteria, such as tests of academic ability and knowledge, didn't predict the effectiveness of foreign service officers and screened out too many minority candidates. So the State Department wanted to hire people not just based on prestigious education and wealthy backgrounds. On one hand, this greatly narrowed the pool of candidates. On the other hand, it didn't reflect the democratic society and the fight against discrimination. People with different skin colors, nationalities, religions, and so on. So they started looking for ways to evaluate people beyond just diplomas and experience. Because the classic approach of looking at a person's alma mater and past workplaces isn't always accurate, and it's inherently limiting. Many did this and many still do. It's assumed that if you worked in certain companies, you're definitely great. And if you haven't worked in them, you're not great. But those who've been in recruiting for a while have noticed that great candidates often come from companies you've never heard of, and you can understand this and learn to select people this way if you learn to interview based on competencies. Let's continue. So how did McClelland work? He started by asking the HR director at the US State Department to name people who performed exceptionally well and those who performed poorly. Then he tried to compare them. What was the difference between them? For this, he came up with an idea. He would ask them about their outstanding achievements and their biggest failures, and he would inquire about the smallest details. He would ask, "Tell me about how you messed up. Tell me about how you achieved something." And he got surprising results. These detailed descriptions of how people achieved results or failed revealed which competencies outstanding performers demonstrated and which they didn't. Many of the skills that experts had previously identified as crucial for job performance turned out to be irrelevant to the day-to-day responsibilities of the people McClelland interviewed. And many companies still do this. Many companies, when opening a vacancy, fantasize about what qualities a person needs and start inventing things like analytical skills, customer orientation, ambition, teamwork, and so on. This just comes from the manager's imagination, like a brand, not based on analysis of employees who actually perform best. When McClelland developed this selection system, he tested it again on a different group of employees and realized that yes, those employees who perform well also do well on his tests. And he realized that's great. It means you can use tests and evaluation systems to pre-select people who will excel at work. So think about this. How many skills that have no relation to people's actual effectiveness do you think are being used in your company right now? Your companies can ask very such abstract, unnecessary questions that may sound interesting but don't tell you anything. Google used to do that back in the day. They made up a bunch of tricky questions, asked them to the candidates, and got famous for it. But similar, why are all hatches round? How many tennis balls will fit in an airplane? How many gas stations there are in the US, and so on. If you've been reduced and you find yourself in a blender, what are you going to do? Then it turns out that these questions are fun, funky, but they don't give any information at all as to how a person will perform. And they've even been strictly banned? No, that's it. We only prohibit this from being done by competency-based interviews. It needs to make you and your company get away from those all fun, funny questions and develop a competency-based interview. So through McClelland's work, a new method was born. It's obvious for us now to ask about any accomplishments, but back then people didn't know about it. It was a breakthrough. That is, the research team developed a method called behavioral interviewing, in which interviewees were asked to provide a brief, detailed account of how they handled several critical work situations, both successful and unsuccessful. To analyze the interview data, the researchers developed a sophisticated content analysis method to identify themes that distinguish outsiders from average performers. What they call themes here? Themes are the things that people talked about most often, the ones that did a good job. For example, successful people often talked about how they took responsibility, while slow people constantly blamed someone. Here, I screwed up because one and the other is at fault. And just like that, the competencies that you and I are using right now were born. Think about this one more thing. Have you ever tried to figure out what separates your best employees from your average ones? A lot of companies that have come to this realization, they've changed their HR practices dramatically. They analyze their employees first and foremost. We realized what makes the best employees better, started selecting people with these qualities, and began to develop these qualities first of all. It's Google, it's many well-known FMCG companies. I used to work 1 year, even 1.5 years in an FMCG company and interviewed many candidates. For me, after the bank, it was very interesting how different the people there are. And when you interview a person from some systems company, Kraft, for example, in the model, or there's also Dell, Rigel, Mars company, and now it was the same people. And from some little-known companies, it was other people, non-systematic, they even behaved differently at the interview. Because some companies have carved out this kind of code of success for themselves, and other companies have done so and failed to do so. And all we had to do was try to somehow take people who had worked for a successful company. This rarely succeeded because these people also in general already valued a lot, not cheap, and wanted to work for other successful companies. That's how competencies were born. The themes were grouped into a small set of competencies that the research hypothesized the researchers were determinants of job excellence. McClelland's article combined with the work of Douglas Abry and his colleagues at AT in the US, in which they presented evidence that competencies can be assessed through assessment centers and that success on the job can to some extent be predetermined in advance, have laid the groundwork for popularizing the competence movement. So in general, the competency movement, competencies, they became popular not that long ago. Somewhere around the 80s of the last century is the beginning of the intensification of the use of competencies. Success at work is important to remember. You can predetermine it in advance. That is, by talking to a person and knowing how to ask the right questions, you can tell right away whether or not he or she would be a successful candidate for the position. What is the difference between the competency utilization method and a simple job analysis? Analyzing a post is when a manager sits down and thinks like this. Look, 2 approaches so you can feel the difference. One supervisor. He sits down, he thinks, I need a marketer. What should a marketer do? and writes a list of responsibilities or copies from the internet. Then he thinks, okay, what does a marketer need to know? What should a marketer be able to do? What personality traits should a marketer have? And takes those answers just from the background. It's just not where it comes from. It's some biases, some articles he's read, some patterns, some other jobs he's seen, and form requirements for the candidate, gives to the recruiter such a person is looking for, then the manager does not like. Second supervisor, he asks himself slightly different questions. Okay, I need a marketer. What my marketers do, in fact. They do this. What do my top marketers know? What do my best marketers know how to do? How do my top marketers behave? And so describes these people and find me people like me. Even go and talk to them. And find me one just like it. That's the right approach. That's the essence of a competency-based interview. So if you are describing the competencies required to do the job based on responsibilities, you are not developing the competency profile correctly, even if you then apply the competency interview. What now? There are still a few trends. Companies rely on past research. Few try to understand things themselves. They look for simple and cheap ways to describe competencies. They love ready-made competency libraries. They often have to describe competencies for new roles where there's no opportunity to study job representatives, but it's a fact it can be difficult and there are solutions for that. They try to find a single universal model for everyone, or they try to make a competency model for managers first, then adapt it for employees. The focus is often skewed toward job requirements rather than candidates' past performance. Also, company structure often changes and the competency model can become outdated. That's what's happening. Companies also hire consultants to develop competencies because HR often lacks expertise, although it's not difficult. That expertise can be acquired. What is competence? Competence comes from the Latin word competentia, which means authorized to judge and also has the right to speak. To explain it, a competency is a set of interrelated skills, knowledge, and personality traits that manifest in an employee's behavior and determine their success in performing work tasks. It's important to know two similar terms here. They're slightly different. There's competence, which means skill and achieved level of effectiveness. And there are competencies of I, meaning behavior. Competence can also be called professionalism. One describes what people can do, while the other focuses on how they do it. Here's a comparative table showing the differences between competence or professionalism and competency, which is more about behavior. Also, competency isn't just knowledge or skills, it's something else. Because knowledge is just having information in your head, a skill is experience. Competence is a certain level of experience you've achieved. Competency itself is much more complex and consists of several components. The way we behave consists of our knowledge and experience we've gained, called skills. These are visible things. But there are hidden aspects that a person sometimes doesn't even realize. It's our self-assessment. That is what we believe about ourselves. Our beliefs? It's our personality traits and our motivation, what drives us. So two people with the same knowledge, even with the same experience, will perform differently. Because their self-esteem, personalities, and motives will definitely be different. Therefore, evaluating classic recruitment, selecting employees based on their diploma, how they graduated, and based on past positions and companies they've worked for, is exclusively assessing knowledge and skills. In this case, you ignore the hidden part and don't really predict a person's future work, sometimes even leading to surprises. How come? The person knows so much. They can do so many things. They worked for such a company in such a position. Why are they failing us? Something's wrong. Here's why. We didn't assess these three elements. So what's the conclusion? An employee's efficiency and effectiveness depends not only on what a person knows, but how they behave and why. And this breaks down into their competence, competencies, and values. Accordingly, two terms appear: soft skills and hard skills, and that's what we usually evaluate in interviews. By the way, people who have mastered competency-based interviewing begin to be able to assess the professionalism of people in occupations they themselves aren't proficient in. Once you've mastered competency-based interviewing, you can interview a programmer, a marketer, a financier, anyone, even without knowing anything about the profession, because you know how to ask the right questions and how to evaluate properly. I remember in my career I was once tasked with building a brand marketing department. I had to select about 8 people. I knew absolutely nothing about brand managers because I wasn't a marketer by training, but I knew competency-based interviews. I knew how to interview them. I started interviewing people, asking them the right questions. After about 10 interviews, I began to understand what answers I should hear. After about 30 to 40 interviews, I started to notice that I knew the answers better than most brand managers. I don't know, maybe after about 9 months, I even thought that I'd probably ace an interview for this position myself because I knew the right answer to any question. I even considered sending my resume to some company just for fun to go through an interview. Fortunately, I was very busy and didn't pursue such nonsense. But I understood brand managers perfectly because I knew what questions to ask. So hard skills, which we translate as tvrdi навыки, we call competence. These are a person's professional and technical knowledge, what's inherent to the profession. And competencies, or what we also call soft skills, are мягкие навыки. Why are they soft? Because they're transferable from one profession to another, from one position to another. They're universal. Whether you're a marketer, a financier, or a charmer, you may need the same competencies. They can be grouped into sets of competencies for managing tasks, managing people or relationships, and managing yourself. All that talk about corporate culture and values, those are also competencies, soft skills that are about behavior. It's considered that truly successful people are those who have developed both hard skills and soft skills. And here, a recruiter who has mastered competency-based interviewing becomes someone who can ideally assess soft skills, provide detailed information to the client, and also evaluate hard skills because they know what questions to ask and how to assess candidates' answers. That means quickly grasping the nature of the position. They also understand the role well. I shared my own example that after a few interviews, I gained the knowledge level of a brand manager, probably equivalent to a junior brand manager. So I knew what needed to be done, how a brand is developed, brand strategy, what a brand budget consists of, how target audience research is conducted. What are brand characteristics? What types of brand activities exist? A lot about brand evaluation metrics. I really knew a lot. Simply because I knew how to ask the right questions and people told me and I memorized it. Then I'd compare answers and understand who was sitting in front of me. A beginner brand manager. A brand manager who doesn't really understand anything. Or truly a natural talent who knows their stuff incredibly well. Maybe they had worked before. I had a few hires there. People who worked at some small little-known companies, but they had such great brand knowledge that we hired them, gave them big brands, and they launched them. We launched many brands like water in Ukraine, an aloe vera-based drink, I've forgotten the 3-letter company name now, and many others. So we've established that competencies are about observable behavior. Some companies describe competencies themselves and conduct their own research. It's important to meet several requirements when describing competencies. There's a set of requirements if the company describes them independently. What does a competency look like in general? A competency is a set of text that consists of a title. Once upon a time, competencies didn't have names. When McClellan first started, no one knew these popular terms. Goal achievement, teamwork, results orientation, leadership, and so on. It wasn't even thought about. But when they started studying it in detail, they described it and came up with names. We see these names a lot nowadays. That's why competencies have names. Besides the name, there's a definition. This is a very important part. I have an interesting experience. When I was working at STB TV channel and discussing vacancies with managers, they often mentioned analytical thinking or an analytical mindset. As an experienced recruiter, I understood this to mean a certain competency. Then I noticed that different managers, interviewing the same candidates, assessed analytical mindset very differently. I said, let's figure this out. Let's sit down and agree on what we mean by an analytical mindset, how someone with an analytical mindset behaves, and how someone without it behaves. And it turned out they had very different ideas. So I listened to all sides, described it, showed them, and said, let's agree on this and use it as our starting point. That's why there's a definition. Definitions help everyone view competencies the same way, and there are also indicators. They can be positive or negative. Indicators are what people say when talking about their experiences. If they have a developed competency, they'll use words from positive indicators. If not, they'll use words from negative indicators. Now for the next interesting piece of information, if you develop a competency for every position in the company, it can get complicated, time-consuming, and expensive. What do companies do? They often start with one competency model for the entire company. They come up with a set of competencies for the whole company and evaluate all candidates based on these. It's usually related to corporate culture and values. Then they might develop specific competencies for each function or department, considering the specifics of work in that area. And further, they can develop competencies for each position. So there are 3 levels of detail. From a recruiter's perspective, it's easier to work when competencies are developed for each position. But it can be the case that recruiters use competencies at the function or organization level. So these 3 levels are described. There will also be an example of competency profiles. By the way, if the company isn't very large, a general competency model might suffice for now. This is a description of these 3 levels. Next is the use of competencies in business. So who first started using this in business? In his book Leadership in Administration, Philip Selznick was one of the first authors to recognize that an organization's internal factors, such as its personnel and previous experience, are critical to its chances of success in implementing chosen policies. For example, an organization that has accumulated expertise in producing a premium quality product may be incapable of mass producing a cheap product. Therefore, the company's competencies should be linked to the strategy. This is very important. It's desirable that these competencies are not taken out of context, but that everything is synchronized. Here's a set of benefits a company gains when it starts utilizing competencies. In this course, we're talking about competencies in recruiting, but of course, competencies can be used in training, development, talent pool management, assessment, and so on. But if you need to convince management to use competencies in recruiting, you can rely on these arguments. There are also myths about competencies, unfortunately. There's an opinion that if you hire a person with super competencies, they'll manage just fine. That's not true. No matter how stellar a candidate may be, if their work is poorly organized, even competencies won't help. So it's worth looking at work organization. Second, if a person has excellent competencies, they're automatically a top player and will always be one. Also not true? We need to assess behavior. That's a fact, but you also have to evaluate results. And the third myth is that competencies are innate. On one hand, yes, innate characteristics do shape competencies, but at the same time, competencies consist of things people develop through experience, acquiring new knowledge, and changing their motivations. So competencies can be changed. Now I promise to share what competency libraries are available. My favorite competency library is the TMA Competency Library. If I'm not mistaken, it's a Dutch company that developed it and consults on competencies. They developed a library, translated it into 11 languages, and made it freely available online with descriptions and even interview questions. Excuse me? Anyway, it's very convenient, but it's not the only model. Of course, when you talk about competencies with someone, they might mention the Lominger model. The Lominger model is a very well-known competency model. It's now owned by Korn Ferry International. It's described in a book sold on Amazon, and the print version is called FYI, for your improvement. It's a set of cards with very detailed competency descriptions, and these same competencies circulate among people in various forms as files. Then there's the Deloitte model in conjunction with USA. I don't know how it was created. I got the document as it is. Apparently it was somehow implemented in Ukraine. For example, I couldn't find an equivalent document in English. It seems that as part of some project, they developed a rather large list of competencies with very good descriptions. It's free, not for sale. It's very good. It also outlines different levels. By the way, this is another way to describe competencies, where a competency is described from a minimum level to a maximum level. And in a company, different job levels may require different levels of competency development. There are books on competencies such as the Competency Handbook or Competence at Work by Spencer. This book is considered one of the best on competencies. Homework. For one of your job openings, choose 3 competencies from the Deloitte or TMA library and explain why you chose these 3 and how you link them to success in the job. Next, we'll talk about how to create a candidate profile for interviews that takes into account the right competencies. That's all. Thank you to everyone who was online with me. I invite those who aren't on the course yet to take it, learn how to conduct competency-based interviews, and learn how to assess candidates more accurately. You'll also get a set of questions and tools to help you with this. Thank you all. Bye-bye. See you soon.